Welcome to the Real Life Buyer podcast. In this podcast, you will hear interviews with business owners, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, authors, and technical specialists in their field. These professionals will hasten your development, accelerate your career, and broaden your business know-how. Now, introducing your host, Dave Barr, interviewing with a purchasing twist.
Hello, and welcome to the Real Life Buyer. Setbacks are all too common in life, but what is important is how we deal with these challenges and convert them into opportunities for success. My guest today, Keagen Hadley, is an occupational therapy doctor specializing in using psychological treatments such as acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, to improve the lives of his patients. Keagen has recently published a book called Torn: Overcoming the Psychological Challenges Post-ACL Injury. This book discusses Keagen's story as an athlete in college and the struggles he faced as a result of his injuries. What is of particular note in this book is not the focus on the physical side of the injury per se, but how Keagen advocates for the need for special care to be taken on the emotional and psychological sides of injuries, and how developing psychological skills changed his life. So let's discover how Keagen dealt with his injury and made the mental changes he needed to empower himself. So without further ado, I welcome Keagen onto the podcast. Hi, Keagen.
Hey, Dave. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Thank you for joining us today. It's going to be a really interesting podcast, I'm sure. So let's jump back and rewind the clock a little minute. Can you explain what happened to you and the impact it had on your life in those early years?
Yeah, so I was a football player for a long time, roughly 20 years or so. And I dealt with a lot of injuries throughout my career. Later in my career, when I was in college, and then I played briefly afterward, I tore my one ACL and then the other one in decently quick succession. And what I found is that the psychological side of injuries affected me quite a bit more than the physical, aspect of the injuries did. And, as a result, my life kind of turned upside down, and I went down a difficult path, until I found the psychological flexibility skills, and it rather, changed my life around. So.
Okay, so it was quite a tough period. Is there an idea of the kind of period of time that you really struggled for a while? Are we talking months or even years?
I would say the worst was probably about 6 to 8 months.
Right. Okay. Now, for those of us who are not medical experts, what is an ACL, or an anterior cruciate ligament injury?
Yep. So it's one of the four main ligaments in the knee that provide stability when you're, walking, running, any kind of sports activity. It essentially acts as the brakes. If you can imagine a car stopping, it prevents your femur or your thigh bone from moving over your tibia or shin bone, if that makes sense. So it prevents anterior translation of the two long bones.
Okay. So as you said, that really affected you physically, but you struggled with the psychological consequences. So can you describe to us the kind of symptoms that you've either seen or experienced while suffering from such a significant trauma?
Yep. One of the main things that I found within my own personal experience, as well as with, a number of clients, is the loss of self-identity, which, affects confidence, self-esteem, a wide array of different things that happen through people's life. And that can lead to depression or anxiety with how to, deal with the future. So that's extremely common in injuries that have a long rehabilitation period.
Okay. So you say self-esteem. You were obviously very successful. Was there no indication that you had an opportunity to go back into the sport? Is that the thing that affected you the most? Or what was it that really dragged you down, do you feel?
That's a good question. So essentially, it was just the overall feeling and picture people generally get when someone tears their ACL is generally they're done playing sports and those kinds of things. So knowing that, the only time at that point in my life when I had my first ACL tear on my left leg when I was a junior in college, I hadn't really been around anyone closely that had that injury. I only, saw what I did on SportsCenter, and I knew it was obviously very traumatic, and many times athletes didn't recover. So coming to grips with that meant that, I definitely am not as invincible as I thought, and second, I hope I can get back to where I was. And it was a lot of uncertainty just on, what I'd be doing in the future, because up until that point, I had spent pretty much, my whole life identifying as a football player. So having that just taken away and woken up, the day after the injury, knowing that I wasn't going to be playing for, a while was quite difficult. It really makes you take a look in the mirror and figure out who are you besides, that identity that you identify closely with.
Yeah, so obviously this is a major passion for you. This is your one key goal in life, is to become obviously a very competent sports player. And with that main goal taken away, it really knocked you for six, basically. I'm just trying to peel back that a little bit to understand more, because you were a lot more than just a sports player as an individual, but you kind of don't see that when you're going through this difficulty. Everything else that you do successfully, that people praise you for, you kind of ignore, you block out and only focus on the injury then.
It essentially, it kind of all ties back to when you meet someone. One of the very first questions that you ask people is, what do you do? Well, I was a football player. Once that was just taken away, as many people would be, it's the similar thing happens when someone retires. They wake up that next morning and they realize, I'm no longer the thing that I've claimed for a long time. So it's just difficult coming to grips with that and really finding out who you are underneath that, because whether or not you realize it, obviously, as you alluded to, there's a lot more that we do on a day-to-day basis than just one particular role. But that being said, there is one that generally is, most prevalent in our own mind anyways.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned about obviously people in a different career where they're going to the office per se. And I guess even in sports, you get into a rhythm that you go and train, you go and work out, you have certain things you do at certain times of the day. That rhythm of working is broken, basically. So, and that's something that people struggle to get back into. So if you're thinking of somebody from an employed position, they've got to take 6 months out of work, now they're out of that rhythm. What do you think are the main barriers for them to reset themselves and rejoin the kind of work environment that you used to have?
Yeah. So what I would say is a lot of times people have to fill that time period. It's the 6 to 8 months. Generally, they probably wouldn't have to be out of the office that long, depending again on what their career is. So, that's kind of speculative at that point, but you have to fill that time when you're not able to physically be at work, still progressing in some facet of your life. Otherwise, you feel like you're just at a standstill. So that's what's most important, is that you can feel like you've still made a progress in an important area of your life when you do make a return to the office or the field or the court or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. So your specialism, obviously, this acceptance and commitment therapy. Can you talk us through what this therapy entails, how long it lasts for, what's the consequences of not having the therapy, for example?
Yep. So ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, is essentially a close cousin, I suppose, to cognitive and behavioral therapy, which is the typical therapy you would, generally, if you're familiar with the therapy industry, that's the most widely used is CBT. And it's very close to that. But the difference is essentially that instead of trying to alleviate all the negative symptomology of your particular condition, which is what CBT aims to do, ACT looks to just arm you so that when you do come to grips with the inevitable next challenge, you're able to deal with it more easily. So essentially that's the slight difference between the two. And they do that by, cultivating the 6 different pillars essentially of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is diffusion, it's purposeful action, mindfulness, self as a perspective, and values.
Okay, so in your own personal case, you were walked through this, this therapy, these 6 pillars. How did that feel? How did that translate? Did you have a one-to-one, should we say, person to look after you for a period of time? Is the period of time weeks, days, months? How did that pan out for you?
Yep. So it's something that I still am in contact with my therapist to this day, and it's been years, but it's something where, it all depends on, what you can do as far as how often you're able to see the therapist because it obviously nothing's free in life, but it lasted for it actually started for me as when I was went through a particularly difficult time in my life where I was suicidal for a time. And I came out of that and knew I needed to go to therapy, obviously. And I started going to therapy, and I got very, very frustrated because I wasn't seeing the progress that I wanted to. I'm one of those kinds of people that if you say, don't look over there, or, don't think that, I'll only look over there and I'll perseverate on that thought even more. So I scoured the internet and found acceptance and commitment therapy and changed therapists and started to slowly climb out of the hole I was in. Obviously, it's not a magic pill, but it was more conducive to my particular brain. And I saw the biggest difference within the first probably 6 months. It really helped me change the way I think about things. It, provided kind of the foundational knowledge of the skills necessary to make it to where I needed to be, and still, helps me to this day.
Okay. Is that therapy one of discussion? You see on the TV, basically somebody on a couch going through the discussion questions and being asked lots of teasers. Is that the kind of thing we're talking here, or does it involve some physical activity as well?
There's lots of different ways to do it. It is psychotherapy generally when you're talking just face to face, much like this. It's essentially psychotherapy, but you can implement it into physical acts as well. That's something that, I'm working with a number of physical therapists right now to be able to implement a course for those kinds of things. But generally, up until this point, it has been more of a psychotherapy or talk therapy between two individuals.
Okay. Now, as a sports person, you're obviously very used to pushing yourself, hitting targets. And you mentioned in that previous statement about you were uncomfortable, not happy with hitting your goals. Just trying to get my head around, what kind of goals were you trying to set for yourself as part of this therapy? What did you expect to achieve and by when?
So a lot of times when anyone starts therapy, they expect to feel better, or they expect to start to make some progress in their daily life. And then that wasn't happening for me. For whatever reason, my brain didn't really like CBT. So that's what kind of prompted me to look, elsewhere. I mean, there must be an answer. There must be others like me that aren't really seeing the kind of progress that they want to, out of therapy, just so I could be more effective in my day-to-day life, because at that point I was really struggling with pretty much every facet of my life. So
yeah. And obviously you became very stressed at a point. Obviously you mentioned that you became suicidal, which is, I guess, probably the worst extreme of things, but you recognized that. Some people don't recognize it. Of course, they're in denial. What's the kind of things that you, in your particular case, enabled you to understand what was happening and take the action that other people perhaps aren't able to do?
I think it was realizing where I was. The one of the first aspects, obviously, of ACT is, as you can imagine by the name, is acceptance. And that's something that I came to grips with, even prior a little bit to coming to therapy, as I needed to learn from where I was and what I'd been through, and make sure that it didn't, continue to happen to me on a reoccurring basis. So that's something I knew my life wasn't going to end up really where I wanted it to be if I kept down the same path.
Yeah. So trying to understand the kind of techniques, the exercises that you took to change the way you were thinking, the mindfulness, the mindset, the mental training, what sort of things would you say particularly worked well for you, and what do you advocate and help other people with?
Yep. So that first session, I told you that I was able to start slowly climbing out of where I was. I was introduced to the principle of diffusion, essentially, which is diffusing from our perseverative negative thoughts. And for me personally, I'll use my own example. Mine was, I am broken. I've had that for, a very long time. I've always struggled with mental health struggles as far as panic attacks. And then that was only compounded by the, physical injuries and then, subsequent nosedive that I went down. So I had all those thoughts that always just kept coming up, that was, I am broken, and I just couldn't get rid of it. And one of the first things I learned was, as I said, diffusion. And essentially that is realizing it's a slight difference between I am broken and I am having thoughts and feelings that I'm broken, because we are not our thoughts. We can't control our thoughts. If you ever figure out how to do that, please let me know. I'd be very interested. But it was just realizing that, we are not controlling our thoughts, but we can control how we view them and give ourselves enough space to be able to evaluate them and see if they're going to help us pursue our values, which is, the sixth foundational principle of ACT.
I see when people are trying to help others with their mindset, they use techniques like putting, let's say, positive things on Post-it notes and dropping it on the mirror. And every time they go to the mirror, they can read these positive statements. Is that the sort of things that you find works well? What other things really work well to change your mind that people could employ? Listen to the podcast.
One thing that truly helped me, and it was exercise I did that first day, and it's something that all your listeners could do, is think about, one thought that, has been particularly, pervasive in your life. Again, mine was, I am broken. Think about whatever that was, grab a timer and say, for 30 seconds, at least one time a second, say that, word. For me, it was broken. And if you do that, you're going to realize again that words, once you're halfway through or 3/4 of the way through that particular exercise, you're going to realize that the word becomes just sounds. You're going to, notice that maybe, the B really sticks out and the N really sticks out, or whatever the case may be. And you'll be able to start slowly realizing, oh, it's literally just a word, and that gives you a little distance from that just a minute ago, a very difficult thought that you have routinely. And that's what really worked for me, as well as I also spend a lot of time, figuring out how to, again, deal with difficult emotions. As someone who has had panic attacks a long time, you have to get rather comfortable in the uncomfortable. So I do a lot of extremely, cold showers and those kinds of things, and getting comfortable with those difficult feelings, because it's obviously not comfortable when you have, a panic attack upcoming. So if you're able to sit there with those difficult, sensations or feelings, you'll notice that they generally subside a lot quicker than if you're trying to avoid them.
Yeah. Do you find routine is important? Maybe you first get up, you do some exercise, you do certain things at certain times. Do they really work?
Yeah, certainly. Keeping to a schedule helps you stay on the path, because again, you're either taking one step forward today or you're taking one step back. Generally, is how it goes. So, and I'm still on the path. So it is, one of those things that any guardrails that you can put up for yourself, like a routine, are very, very helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm thinking about the external influences. Now we all listen quite possibly to podcasts, hopefully, including this one, of course. But there's lots of things out on social media. There's positive mindset videos, obviously podcasts, the people you surround yourself with. What influences from the external, other than your therapist, did you find were particularly helpful?
Like I said, I'm a therapist, so I gravitate heavily towards those kinds of individuals. I like all of the videos and things I've seen of Dr. Stephen Hayes. He's kind of the godfather of ACT. So I heavily gravitate towards him, as well as Dr. John Deloney. He's got a lot of really helpful stuff. He's struggled with a lot of similar anxiety type symptoms that I have in the past. They're very, very useful.
Yeah, so they are effective then, because they're so prevalent on all the social media channels. Sometimes you wonder if it's more for show than it is actually really helping people. But you're saying it actually can help people if you focus on it and practice it regularly, daily, even.
Yeah, certainly, and it can impact your entire life. There's a lot of research I put into the book, that because obviously athletes aren't known for being great therapy patients. I also was able to kind of package it in a way that, shows that there's a lot of efficacy for ACT being used to, improve your performance, whether that be, on the field or, potentially just in your day-to-day life. So I think that's very important as well.
Cool. Now I'm thinking of, let's pretend you are an employee in this case, and you're going to be going back into the workplace. So for employers who have the challenge of both losing a valuable employee for a time and then they're going to come back into the workplace, how may they help them to recover and integrate back into the workplace after being away for possibly quite a considerable time?
I think transparency is usually the best way to approach everything. That being said, if you're you're the employee, being very upfront with what your current situation is, what the doctor's saying, your turn will be like, and what your limitations are. If you're very forthcoming with that, I would hope a good leader would, find a way to be as accommodating as possible and work you back into maybe other aspects where you're not maybe able to be as mobile, or, other facets of your career, because there's more to any job than just, walking around the office or whatever the case may be. So I am sure there's other facets that you'd be able to be very, very productive in still. Yeah. Especially now in the realm of remote work. I'm sure there's a lot of ways you could be very effective still.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of, well, as the other support structures, and these are your friends, your family, your colleagues, obviously. And quite often people don't know the struggle you've been through. They're not sure of what to say and how to behave, what words to use when you're back on the scene, so to speak. What do you think are the most positive and perhaps best avoided behaviors and words to use when you're dealing with people who have suffered, say, a trauma and an injury like you have?
I don't know if it's necessarily a word or, phrase, anything magical I can tell you. But what I will say is it's definitely more important to listen and be there than to try to connect with what they're going through, especially if you haven't, went through what they're going through. It's very hard to, you can be, empathetic and all those things, but you're not going to really fully understand what they're going through. So just you being there, and listening is one of the best gifts you can give to anyone going through a traumatic physical injury.
Yeah, because it can be quite difficult, because if you don't know what to say, sometimes people say nothing. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Just pretend it never happened. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, for example, ask them, how they're doing, and then listen. You can prompt the conversation and then not, say, oh, I totally understand how you're feeling, or something like that, because you likely don't. In most situations, we don't have that exact experience. So I would say you could prompt the conversation and let them know that you're there for them. You're here to listen, and you're here to just be with them, which is a lot of times, when someone loses who they are, their self-identity piece, they feel very alone. It's very isolating. So just having someone, in the vicinity that, you can trust talking is very, very important. And it's something I definitely learned way too late. So,
yeah, so it's certainly more about as you say, the auditory things. You've got to obviously be very careful about what you say, and that's always difficult. But you said most of it's down to listening. Are there any certain behaviors, that you ought to think about before you suggest things, particularly with a physical injury in that respect? Come on, mate, get back on the wagon, you're okay. That kind of crazy stuff that people trying to shrug it off for you and try and give you some, let's say, something positive to work on. But actually, that might be more damaging.
It all depends on your relationship with the person. So it's very hard for me to fit into the context of every possible relationship. If it's someone you're particularly close with and you can tell they're down and you're trying to get them to come out and go on a walk with you, yeah, give them a bit of a hard time. Actually might be, your guys' way in that particular relationship to, get their rear end moving. But many times the hardest part about these kinds of injuries, whether that be, knee joint injuries or even like Achilles injuries, is the person looks fine. They don't have a cast on. And for a lot of the recovery period, they don't have, a brace on or crutches or anything visible. So to the naked eye, they look fine, but they're still definitely struggling. So just keeping that in mind is very, very important. But again, as you alluded to, there's a lot of different kinds of relationships. So just be very mindful and understand that just because someone looks, okay, physically, they still could be, very, very worrisome about where they're at in their particular recovery process.
Yeah, because people could put on a brave front. So they pretend to give the image that everything's great and fine, but in reality, they're hurting somewhat.
Yeah, 100%. And that's usually the case, especially with athletes. So
yeah. So tell us a little bit about your book. Where did, I can tell the inspiration come from your own journey, but to write a book is no mean feat. It's an awful lot of work. You put yourself under perhaps some pressure. So, can you tell us a little bit about what was going through your head when you decided, I'm going to write a book about this, I'm going to help other people? What was the catalyst for you, and what's the ultimate goal of that book for you?
Yeah. So essentially it happened very organically. I'm a writer just in nature. It's what I do as part of that schedule. We, previously talked about, I write for 20 minutes a day, just on, whatever I'm feeling like that day, whether that be something in fiction or just how, what I'm feeling that day. And as a result of that, my therapist employed that obviously as an intervention to go through the healing process. So I would start to outline just how I was feeling, what I experienced, and that journaling actually became, my book. My book essentially outlines my kind of history as an athlete, ranging from my freshman year of high school when I started really having, panic attacks to, after my second ACL injury and, the events that led to me being, very, very, very down for a time. So it essentially just goes through those stories and provides the literature on why I would have been, much better in all those situations if I would have cultivated or had any semblance of a, psychological flexibility processes in my life at those times. So it just advocates for people to employ that and, seek out help. Usually it'd be much more beneficial prior to, a traumatic event happening. Like anything else, an ounce of, prevention is worth quite a bit. That's what I would say.
Yeah. So I've got a few more questions, but I want people to understand where's the best place to understand, obviously what you put out in social media, I believe you have your own website, obviously go and buy your book, but where can people find out more about you and what you do and perhaps immerse themselves, with your information to help them?
Yeah, certainly. I'm on social medias, Instagram and Twitter. I'll be honest. I don't have a ton of love for social media, so I will always respond to people, but I'm not as active as I likely should be. But I'm at Instagram and Twitter at the ACL Therapist, and then I have my own website as well with a ton of information on all kinds of physical injuries. So that's KeagenHadley.com, or if you're struggling with the spelling of my name, which is understandable, it's theacltherapist.com. It'll take you to the same place.
Okay. So I'm quite curious now. You've obviously met a number of people in your journey. What things can you say that how have you helped other people? What sort of techniques, what sort of success story can you tell us about where you've actually made a huge difference to somebody else in their journey?
One of the people I'm particularly fond of, just because they have a very similar story to myself. They even play a similar position in football. They tore it the same type of year in college. So I spoke extensively with this gentleman who's a college football player this last summer, and he was really struggling with confidence. One of the main downfalls after these injuries is being able to trust that leg again, because essentially it's you did everything you were likely supposed to do, and this tiny little ligament in your leg still gave out for whatever reason. So just trusting that leg again is particularly difficult. So I had a lot of conversations with him just on how to go about doing that, different psychological techniques to employ to get him to focus on what he can do, because it's a lot of times very frustrating when, I can't do this, that, and the other thing, when you're not focusing on, how far you've came, since the injury. So that, as well as I've provided a lot of tips on how to train, more for joints, because a lot of the times I still train, essentially like I'm still an athlete, but I have a slight difference where everything I do is focusing on my joints, essentially. So I train obviously quite a bit different than I did back in the day, but, I gave him a lot of tips on how to, proceed and how to really challenge his leg physically so he could have that confidence when he got back on the field. And I'm happy to say he had a fantastic year statistically and otherwise, and he's doing very, very well.
That's really good to hear. And did you find helping other people is a therapy in itself for you?
I found that it's actually, I never knew, one of your greatest fears, I guess, as an athlete is as soon as you're done, you're never going to have that thrill again. And I can tell you that it's definitely exponentially more thrilling and gratifying to help others, especially when you didn't have anyone in those particular situations. So it gives me and a lot of hope, for not only myself, but a lot of the people that I work with. Okay.
So the last question then, what's currently in perhaps your next 12 months that is getting you most excited and passionate about how you're going to help other people or help yourself?
I've spent a lot of time, as my background with a writer, working with a number of physical therapists who are in the ACT space. We're developing a framework to give to physical practitioners, because many times, again, there's not a lot of young athletes or athletes just in general that are going to a psychotherapist frequently. So the way to combat that is to provide a framework and training for athletes who are seeing, or for practitioners who are seeing athletes routinely, like athletic trainers, physical therapists, those types of individuals. And we're creating a framework in which those practitioners can address rudimentary, psychological struggles in their athletes, which will only prepare them better if they are injured. Hopefully that doesn't happen, obviously, but it's unfortunately inevitable at some point. So.
Cool. Do you see this cascading down to not just the higher level athletes, but to younger people in general who are in early years in school?
I would hope actually that that's where it's at even more, because obviously the professional athletes have, the resources to, if they know they need a therapist and they're accepting to have a therapist, they can certainly do that. But it's actually more important at like high schools, in those kinds of places where they generally don't probably have a psychologist on staff, or any kind of therapist. So providing those skills to a athletic trainer is very, very important for the overall health of their athletes.
Fantastic. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Keagen. Obviously, there's a lot of thoughts that you've shared today, and it does make me sit back and think about how the mind is so influential with ourselves, not just a physical injury, but the mental injury as well. So that's been very useful. I found it great information, and thank you for sharing today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
Cheers. So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.